Nur noch 2 Plätze, schnell sein. Sitzen?
Ja, legen wir los. All right. Cool. Okay. Let's start almost on time. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this session, which is about transforming diverse system landscapes into sustainable API products with Azure API Management. We're going to take a look at first. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Azure API Management, just to bring everybody on the same page. After that, we're going to talk about how to deal with diversity, namely diverse system landscapes and Azure API Management, and how to achieve sustainability when publishing API products. In the end, there will also be a live demo where we will together integrate an API and publish an API product by using the Azure portal, doing it ourselves. And for now, I know it's been a long day. You don't have to do anything right now, just lean back, relax, and let me take you on this journey. If you have any questions throughout the sessions, please try to remember it. I mean, you could forget if you want, but please try to remember it because there will be some time for questions in the end of this session. And with that, let me tell you a few words about myself. My name is Tobias. I'm a software architect and part-time lecturer for C#.net. I teach what I actually do on a daily basis, which is developing APIs at small and large scale for digital products. I work at the company Software, and we are located in Asten. Currently, I'm holding a few Azure certificates, and besides that, I like motorcycles, good coffee, and of course, Azure. And with that, let's jump right into it and talk about what is Azure API Management. So Azure API Management is a hybrid cloud service and platform for publishing, securing, maintaining, and analyzing your company's APIs. And if you're familiar with traditional API gateways, you can think of API Management in Azure as some kind of very comprehensive API gateway that is hosted for you as a service in Azure. How does it work? Let's take a look at APIM in action. And when I think of an example for Azure API Management, I always like to think of a bigger corporate, a bigger organization that evolved year over year, maybe acquired some new branches and some new locations. So we have a kind of diverse system landscape. So if you take a look on the right side, there's our diverse system landscape. There might be a JSON-based API that is hosted in Azure. There may be some legacy backend system which still provides XML data. Some project teams also decided to host a JSON-based API in Amazon, and there might be many more APIs. So that's our diverse system landscape. And on the left side, we have our consumers. And with consumers, I mean the actual consuming apps, which could be a mobile app, a web app, or maybe other web services that want to consume our data from our diverse backend systems. And in order to streamline, centralize, and standardize the access to our backend data, to our backend APIs, we can make use of Azure API Management as a service here. But Azure API Management actually does a lot more because it also provides useful information for the actual consuming app developers. So me as a developer, I can just open the developer portal, as we will see later on, and take a look at what APIs are published and how I can integrate them into my consuming apps. One important thing to understand when starting to work with Azure API Management is what components it consists of. And thankfully, that's pretty simple, as there are just 3 components which we need to keep in mind. There's the admin interface, the gateway, and the developer portal. And you should, to some extent, understand these 3 components when working with Azure API Management, which is why we're going to take a look at each of them in detail right now. I'd like to start with the admin interface. And the admin interface is the main component for the API publishers. So we as a corporate, we as an organization want to publish APIs in order for the consuming apps to being able to integrate it into their systems, services, and apps. These consumer apps can be internal as well as external. And I, as a publisher, or we as a publisher, can first of all import API specifications from our backend system. So let's say we have an open API document or a web service description file. I can simply import it into my Azure API Management instance and work with it. We can implement policies. Now, policies is a very interesting and powerful concept with regards to Azure API Management, because we can do a lot of things. We will talk about them in detail just in a few minutes. With policies, I can enforce things like security, caching, or even transforming request and response payloads. Via the admin interface, of course, I can also create and publish API products. I can manage users and groups, and there's some built-in default analytics, so I can also take a look at those. And that's it for the admin interface. Now let's move on to the gateway. As the name says, this is the actual gateway component, so the main component for the consuming apps, the API gateway. You can think of it like that. The API gateway, first of all, enforces access control if configured correctly. This might be a simple access control based on an API key, but also more sophisticated things like an OAuth flow if you want. By making use of gateway policies, we can do many different things. A very powerful concept is we can transform request and response payloads. So we could, for example, convert from JSON to XML and back from XML to JSON if we want. Of course, the gateway also routes the calls to the corresponding backend system, and we could, again, make some more policies, let's say cached responses, in order to reduce the load that is transmitted to our backend systems, which might not have the best hardware resources provisioned, for example. So that's it for the gateway. The last component missing here is the developer portal, and as the name says, this is the main component for the consuming app developers. The developer portal is actually a web page, a website that comes with Azure API Management. It's an option, so you do not have to use it, but you can if you want. And you can read API documentation. They can test the APIs. It's similar to Swagger UI, if you're familiar with that, but we will see it later on. They can view at code samples. And very important concept, they can subscribe to APIs. They can create a subscription. So me as a developer, I have to register, confirm my email address, and after that I can create a subscription to obtain an API key and being able to access and use the APIs. That gives me, as an API publisher, also the possibility to revoke subscriptions and revoke access to my published APIs if I want to, which is pretty cool and comes pretty much for free with Azure API Management. So these are the three main components. Just for now, just keep in mind the admin interface is the one for the API publishers, the gateway is for the consuming apps, and the developer portal for the consuming app developers. So that's it for the introduction. I hope you're with me right here. Now I want to go further on and talk about how to deal with diversity. So the first thing when working with Azure API Management will be, you will want to integrate an API, right? You have some backend system, some API, you want to integrate it into the instance in order to publish it as a product. And thankfully, Azure API Management from scratch supports already a big set of API specifications and protocols. So as long as your API is, let's say, an open API-based specification, or it's SOAP, you have a web service description file, or even GraphQL, you're pretty much good to go. It's pretty much a click-through process. If you're using the Azure portal for that, it's a click-through process in order to integrate your APIs into Azure API Management. So that's the specifications and protocols, but let's take a look at where the API is actually running at. And of course, as long as it's running in Azure, you are pretty much good to go. Doesn't matter whether it's a default, it's a standard app service instance, a container instance, or maybe even a cloud native resource. Let's say a function app, you're pretty much good to go. Just select the instance and it will be a resource and it will be integrated into Azure API Management. But wait, what if my API runs on premises? What if I want to integrate an API that runs in my local environment, I have good news for you. There's also official documentation and guidance on how to set up a site-to-site private network. Or if you want, you can even self-host the gateway component on your on-premises system. So this is also pretty cool. And these are just two examples, of course. As long as your API is reachable, you can always manually integrate it into Azure API Management, also if it doesn't correspond to any of the supported, let's say, specifications and protocols. It's always possible to integrate it manually. And I've said it a few times, it's pretty much a click-through thing if you're using the Azure portal, which is why I created a screenshot, which you will see later on actually in the demo. This is what you will be presented when creating a new API by using the Azure portal. So you simply select the type of API you want to create or define, or you can scroll down and select you want to create it based on an open API document, a web service description file, or maybe an existing Azure resource, which might be a function, let's say. So this is pretty cool. And that much about, that's all you need to know about diversity. I think it's good to know that there's a big set of supported specifications, but there's also always the option to integrate manually. And with that, let's move on to how to achieve sustainability. So most of us, I suppose, are developers here, so we're familiar with developing APIs as products themselves. And if you put out a new version of an API, you will want to support it for some period of time, right? So some consuming apps, some clients maybe are going to integrate this specific version into their apps, so you will want to support it. There's the reason for sustainability. And how can we achieve sustainability with Azure API Management? I want to jump back to my initial example. Again, on the right side, we have our diverse system landscape. On the left side, there's the consuming apps. And now there's the middle part, API management, for some kind of streamlined, standardized, centralized way of accessing backend data. The title of the slide says considerations, because before publishing any API product, you might want to consider and think about what are the specific settings and configurations of the product, of the API I actually want to publish. Which can be, it could be, for example, I want to publish a RESTful JSON-based API, and all the requests require an API key in order to not make it completely public. Of course, there will be versioning, and the used version will be determined by request header values. Since we're using a kind of API gateway, there will be URL masking, and on top of that, I want to enforce authentication by validating a JSON web token. So this could be a set of configuration that we want to enforce. And how can we enforce this configuration with Azure API Management? We can make use of gateway policies, which is why now we're going to talk about gateway policies. I'd like to think of gateway policies as some little tasks or jobs, or let's say settings and configurations that are applied between the actual API consumers and the managed API. These are very powerful. There are many built-in, pre-built policies for you, and they can do several things, like already mentioned, format conversion from XML to JSON or from JSON to XML. I can enforce call rate limiting in order to restrict the number of calls. Let's combine call rate limiting with response caching, and I might reduce the load that is, again, transmitted to any legacy backend system running on premises, for example. I can filter requests based on API key, based on IP address if I want. And of course, enforcing authentication. And these are just four examples for pre-built gateway policies. But if you want, you can actually write your own gateway policy by using simple C# code, where you can pretty much do whatever you want. How can we define gateway policies? And for that, we will do that in the Azure portal. I've again brought you a screenshot from the Azure portal. This is what it looks like when defining new policies. So on the left-hand side, I've already integrated some API, I've imported some API operations. I've selected the get request to retriever resource. And right next to it, we can see the front end, which is in this case the consuming app, which must make a GET request to /resource in order to get some data. And then we just follow the little arrows, and we then come to inbound processing, to the inbound processing section, where I can add policies however I want. Just click the button, add policy, select the pre-built policy, or build my own by using C# code. By following the arrows, we can see that after that, the request is transmitted to the actual backend, which will then respond, and there will be an outbound processing section where I can again add policies however I like. After that, it's transmitted back to the front end, to the actual consuming app. So I can leverage and make use of this HTTP request and response round trip, and in there, in the inbound processing, the outbound processing part, actually also in the backend processing, I can define my own policies. And what I like to do, since I'm a developer myself, I always like to switch to code view. So you can see there's a little code icon. If we click that code icon, we can see the actual XML. Funny that this is XML. The XML code that defines the gateway policies used in this example. And there are 4 sections: inbound, backend, outbound, and on error, which corresponds to our request and response round trip, with the exception of on error, where we can define some specific policies in case some error occurs during backend processing, let's say. So this is pretty cool. We have a code view where we can define and see what is actually applied in this operation. But wait, there is more. We can apply gateway policies at different scopes, starting from global scope, which is the complete API management instance, going down to a very specific operation. So let's say if we integrate an XML, a SOAP-based XML service, we will want to convert all the message payloads from JSON to XML in the inbound processing part of that API, because that API is XML-based. So I will apply that policy at API scope. Whereas if I publish a product and I want the whole product to authenticate with JSON Web Tokens, I will apply an authentication policy at product scope in that case, which might contain multiple APIs. So it's always a combination, not only the policy definition, but also the scope where you're applying it at. Enough theory. Let's jump into a live demo. Let's integrate and publish our own API. And this is what we want to do. On the right side, we have a SOAP-based and XML-based API. And on the left side, we have our modern consuming apps, which expect a RESTful JSON-based API. I hope you see the incompatibility there, and which is why we are going to leverage Azure API Management here, the gateway, in order to make this a good match. So the consumers will initiate an API request and will use a JSON document. In there, we will implement an inbound policy, which converts the document from JSON to XML. We could enforce rate limiting if we want, and we will validate an API key because it's kind of natively supported. After validation, the XML document is then transmitted to the backend, and the backend will, of course, first respond with an XML document, right? So we need to implement an outbound policy to convert it back from XML to JSON. We could set a custom response in order to modify what JSON model we want to implement there. And we could cache the response if we want before it is returned to our consuming apps. So this is what we want to build right now. And for that, I'm going to switch to the Azure portal. I hope this is big enough for everyone. So I've already created an Azure API Management instance in the Azure portal because this takes a few minutes. And if we go down to APIs, we can see that this is empty at the moment, or it already has an Echo API, which is a kind of demo API when creating a new instance. So if I want, I can always click the Add API button where I can add a new API. So now let's talk about the API that we actually want to integrate. Thankfully, I found a publicly accessible SOAP XML service called Number Conversion Service. We can also take a look at the web service description file of this service if we want. And the SOAP service provides two SOAP operations, which are number to words a number to dollars. So it basically converts a number to written words. Let's try it out. Type 123, hit invoke, and I get presented a SOAP envelope response, an XML document that states 123. So now let's first step integrate this service into our Azure API Management instance. And for that, I'm just going to copy the URL. Then I'm heading back to my API Management instance, hit Add API, and scroll down to Create from Definition, because this is what we have. We have a web service description file. I always like to switch to full settings in order to see everything that is available, and just paste the URL in here and select the right interface. And after that, we can see this little selector, import method. This seems like a little switch. It says SOAP pass through or SOAP to rest, but it actually does a lot. So this is what we want to do, because it, first of all, maps all the URLs from SOAP-like URLs to kind of RESTful URLs. And it also converts the request and response payloads to JSON for us. So we do not have to write this conversion transformation policy ourselves. The description is fine for now. And if I scroll down here, I can also see the base URL under which my API management instance is available, and under which I can afterwards access this API. And I want to add an URL suffix here, which will be convert. We are not publishing as a product right now, and we also do not want to use versioning right now. Let's just create. And if everything works out within a few seconds, this API will be integrated and we can see the two SOAP operations. And for this demo, I'm just focusing on one operation, which is why I'm deleting number $2 and keeping number to words. Now, the first thing I want to do, if I select it, we can see that the URL was really converted and it's already kind of RESTful. It says number to words. It's a post request. And first of all, I just want to check if everything works as expected. So I go to test, scroll down, and can set a request body. And what we can see here, the request body is already a JSON document. I told you it already converted the model for us with some strange property names, which it took from the SOAP envelope. So UBI_num is the number which will be converted. Let's type 123, hit send. And if everything works out, okay, I get 200, okay. And again, there's a JSON document, which again looks kind of strange with strange property names, but don't worry, we will change that right now. So this, the integration worked out. Let's switch back to design and change some things. And the first thing I want to do is I would like to change this from post to a GET request, because I think this could also be a GET request. And instead of providing the number to convert as a request body, I want just to provide a query parameter value. So I'm going to query right here, add parameter. Let's name this parameter number, the number which we want to convert, and make it a required parameter. Hit save, and that's it. We've just changed the HTTP method to GET and added a query parameter. Remember, this will not be compatible right now because the actual XML backend still expects a post request. So we need to implement an inbound policy that switches the HTTP method from GET to POST. And we're doing that in the coding view, because if we look at the inbound processing, there are already some policies that were applied automatically for us. And I like to switch to code view to see what is actually going on. I hope this is... I don't think I could. No, I can't make you more space right here. But what we can see that we are in the inbound section. There's also some pre-built policies, and one of them looks very interesting, which is the set body policy. This set body policy actually sets the request body that is sent to our XML system API, and we can see that this contains the expected SOAP envelope. First things first. Let's just set the HTTP method by using the set method policy to post, which is what the backend API expects. And after that, we've changed where the number comes from. So the number comes from the query parameter now instead of the body. So we are going to access the number query parameter by using context dot request.original URL.query.number, because we named the query parameter number. And if this number value is present, we want to use it in the SOAP envelope. I have a typo in there. Original. Okay, now it should be fine. So that's it for the inbound section. Now let's go down to the outbound section, and we can see this strange JSON model that was created automatically. I want to simplify this model. There should be just one property, which is called words, and that's what we want to do. So if I do not have another typo in here, we can just hit save, ignore all the warnings, and head over to test. Let's take a look if this works out. I can now add the query parameter 123, hit send, and scroll down, and we can see, oh, okay, thank God, this worked out. 200 okay, and we can see that the response model now has only this one JSON property called words. So we're good for now. What we're still missing is publishing this API. We should publish it as a product able to being used by developers in their consuming apps. For that, I'm going to switch to products in this left pane here, and we can see that there are already 2 demo products that are created by default, but I can add new products by clicking the add button here. We will call this product, let's call it number conversion API. It converts numbers. We publish it right away. And now I can select the APIs that should be included into this product, which will be our number conversion service. Let's hit create. And after that, we will see that the product was created, but the access control is not set how we want it, because we want to include developers and guests here too. So I'm going to select this product, go to access control, and add these 2 groups, developers and guests. Okay, fine with that. And right now, we're all set up. We've just published an API product that contains our numbers service. And now let's switch from API publishers to API publishers to consuming app developers. So we are now app developers, and we want to take a look at what APIs are there to be used by my consuming apps. And I've told you there's a developer portal. The developer portal is an optional thing. You can enable it when making use of Azure API Management, and this is a simple web page that is generated automatically and includes all the published APIs and products. And it has a URL, that you can see here. If we open it, we will see some demo text. So we are at a demo company that has demo API calls and some demo text and so on, but you can customize this page to your specific needs with your specific contents. I'm already logged in right now. And what is interesting is if we switch to APIs. If we switch to APIs, we can see that there's the number conversion service that we created beforehand. And if we select that, we can see that there's one operation, which is the get request, number to words, and it contains our query parameter number. I can also hit try it out, but this will not work right now because I do not have a valid API key. I do not have a subscription to use this API, to use this product. So I need a subscription key first. In order to obtain an API key and create a subscription, remember you first have to register, confirm your email address, and after that you can head over to products, select the number conversion API, and oh, I'm not signed in actually. Okay, let me just sign in quickly. Okay, now I'm signed in. And now I can create a subscription, which I will call my subscription. Hit subscribe, and within a few seconds, I can see that a primary key and a secondary key were generated for me. And I'm also able to regenerate both keys in case they got corrupted somehow. And with that information, I can go back to APIs, again select the number conversion operation, hit try it out, and the primary subscription key is already selected for me right here. Now I type in 123, which is what we want to test. If we scroll down, we can see that we forgot to remove the body description from the operation, which we should have done beforehand, before publishing the API product, but no worries. This is a GET request and we can simply remove it manually right now. And if we hit send, everything should work out. We get 200 OK, and it says 123, which is what we expect. So this is pretty cool. Within, let's say, it took us 10 minutes, maybe 12 minutes, we imported an XML SOAP-based API into Azure API Management instance. We switched the HTTP method. We switched to a query parameter. We converted the message from XML to JSON and back in order to be compatible with the legacy backend system. After that, we published the API product, not completely public, by using a subscription model, using API keys in order to have some kind of access control. And all that was done by using the Azure portal within just 10, 12 minutes. But wait, there's even more. If we switch back to the Azure portal and scroll down to analytics, there's some default analytics that pretty much comes for free when using Azure API Management. And here you can see you have an overview of, in this case, the number of requests based on the APIs, the operations, the products, or even the subscriptions that you have. You have the data transfer, response times, and so on. So there's some default analytics. And on top of that, if you decide to connect an application insights resource to your API management instance, you can even make a more detailed drill down and take a look at logs and traces that were created by the API management instance and for each operation that was called, for example. Of course, we can always also revoke the subscriptions that have been made by the API developers. So simple user and group management is also available. That's it for a live demo. Now let's switch back to the slides and let me just show you. Yeah, this is what we actually just did. This is what we actually just did, except we did not enforce rate limiting and we did not turn on response caching, but this can simply be done. So this is no problem. And on top of that, if you're doing this in a production scenario, you might want to think about the gateway policy order, because you will first want to validate the API key, or you will first want to validate the JSON Web Token, let's say, of your call before converting the request from JSON to XML. So think about the gateway policy order too. Now you might say, okay, this sounds nice. When is the right time to use Azure API Management? And I've copied this table directly from the Microsoft documentation because I think it pretty much sums up based on which criteria you can decide whether this makes sense for you. The first criterion says, the more APIs you've deployed and maintaining, the greater the need is for a central control, a centralization of API control. Of course, the more maintenance overhead you will face as an API maintainer. The second criterion is about the rate of API changes. So let's say your company is putting out new API versions constantly, maybe every 3 to 6 months, let's say. You will want to have a good overview and a good support when maintaining these API versions. And API versioning and revisions are a natively built-in concept of Azure API Management which we have not covered in this talk due to time restriction. But trust me, hit that up on the documentation. There's native support for revisions and versions when working with Azure API Management. And the third criteria is administration load. So the more APIs you provide, the more APIs you publish as products, the greater the need for standardization, streamlining the access. It helps me as an API publisher. So you can think of these three criteria when deciding whether this makes sense for you or not. But wait, there's even more. As I've told you, there is native support for revisions and versions. Take a look on that in the documentation if you're interested in that. One important concept is also mocking APIs and API operations and also response models. Think about, let's say our organization decided to build a new consuming app. But at the moment, there's no backend that provides the necessary data. So what I can do with Azure API Management is just create a dummy API, a dummy operation, and just return some mock data while the backend is being built. So the consuming app can also start using the API, works with some mock responses while the backend system is built. API management also supports hybrid deployments. So as I told you, there's a possibility to integrate your own premises system, or if you want to, you can even self-host the gateway yourself. And there's an extensive set of built-in policies. We've just talked about a few, which are authentication, request-response transformation, response caching, filtering based on IP address, and so on. There's really a big set of built-in policies, and if you want, you can even build your own by using C# code. And with that, let's sum it up. Azure API Management helps me to, or helps us to abstract backend diversity, to standardize our API deployments, and to centralize the control. Centralize the control in order to uniformly publish API products and support them. Policies are a very powerful concept. As we've seen, we can do many different things in there, and there's very comprehensive support for publishing, not only what we've seen in the Azure portal, but also when thinking about versions, revisions, and so on. And with that, I hope there was some useful information for you, and I'm happy to get to your questions. Yes.
Does this support load balancing, or how can I implement load balancing with this?
So Azure API Management is not the resource I would use for load balancing in Azure. That is, I would take a look at different resources because it's not the main goal with Azure API Management here. But of course, in Azure, by making use of other resources, you can simply implement it. Yes. But it's not the main goal of Azure API Management. Any further questions? Yes.
Can I rewrite to different endpoints?
What do you mean by reroute?
Because of the requests going to different endpoints.
Yes. Each request going to different endpoints?
Depending on the parameter.
Oh yeah, that's totally possible. Yes. That's totally possible. So there are different ways you can achieve that. So for example, you can, of course, the APIs that you integrate, whether it's manually or not, they already correspond to the actual URL. And you can decide what products, the operations that you actually publish can, first of all, route to the corresponding backend based on the APIs I've imported. Or if you want, you can always manually override the URL by making use of gateway policies. That is possible, but I would think about doing that because when you do that, you also put some kind of logic into your API management and policy description. So this is something you will want to evaluate very carefully before doing that, which path which way you're doing it. But it's totally doable, yes.
You made mention of being able to run the API in a custom server, for example. So
Yes.
How does that actually work? Is there like a custom agent that needs to be installed, or can you just share that?
So what you actually can self-host is the gateway component, and you will have to somehow still set up an internet connection, of course, to Azure. And what is provided is, I think I've not done this myself, but what is provided is some kind of containerized version of the API management gateway component, and you will have to configure it on your local system, yes.
Additionally, so let's assume I have an API instance on Azure, and I have my microservices in the Linux or the VM separately.
Okay.
Is it actually advisable to create an API route using the API end from Azure to the virtual machine? Given the latency, what would you advise in that case? Is it better to have the API and the microservices on the same network cluster?
That's actually the reason why you would self-host the gateway component. So by self-hosting the gateway component, you can improve API traffic flow, API security. You can maybe there could be some compliance policies of your organization that you must meet. That's the actual use case really that you described there for self-hosting the gateway component. Yes. Okay. Exactly.
So the use case for self-hosting is not only the hybrid environment where you have on-premises and cloud, but also in the cloud, for example, in AKS, I would host an API gateway.
You could do that. You could
for
do
latency
that.
reasons. So.
I mean, if it's already in Azure, if you're Azure, I'm not sure. I cannot answer how big the improvement would be. I'm not sure about that, but you could do that. Yes, you could do that. You could do that.
And one question regarding the lifecycle and the versioning. Did I get it right? So let's assume I start with an API in version 1, and I publish it to use this and that backend. And later on, I'm developing version 2 of this same API, which probably uses a different server as the backend. And then probably version 1 is not supported on the backend side anymore. So I can write this, I can tweak the API management in that way that it will implement version 1 on the API gateway, and we tweak the request such that they are compliant with version 2. Is this also a scenario?
The scenario, yeah, but in your example, I would rather say that you would somehow try to move your clients, your consumers to use.
It's always the better way to move them to the new version.
True.
But if for some reasons I have to support the older versions, but I only have 10% of my customers are using the old version, which I have to support for some newer reasons.
Very good question. So first answer would be try to move to version 2. If you can't, I mean, you could try to tweak it. You've very powerful.
And try the conversion from version 1 to version 2 and use them. So that I only have to maintain the new.
Yeah, but I'd say that's not the way it is intended to be used. It's rather more switch to version 2, or if you don't have any breaking changes, it might not be a complete new version. It might only be a revision of your API. Just the difference between revision and version is whether there's a breaking change when using the API itself. Also there's a pretty good description and documentation if you want. Just take a look at that.
Last question. Does the API management also support this getting something out of life cycle? So can I say, okay, this is version 2, it will become out of date next year, and inform the developers about this upcoming change? Is this a feature that's integrated in the API, or do I have to integrate this feature on my own?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure if that specific feature is somehow supported, but what I can tell you is that since every developer, every consumer app developer has to register, you at least have an overview of who at the end is using it. You at least can see all the subscriptions, and each subscription might correspond to a consuming app. If you wouldn't have this, you wouldn't have any information about that. So at least you could take a look at the subscriptions, get to the email addresses, and
so can leverage database.
Yeah. So that's definitely a way to do it. Okay, since we are slowly running out of time, I just want to again thank you for joining this session. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Also add me on LinkedIn if you want, and I'm also around here at Global Azure. Also like to say thanks to all the organizers, and thanks for having me. Have a nice day. Thank you.